Welcome, friends, to the Jacobin Show. I am your host, David Griscom. The show is produced by my good friend and comrade and super producer, Matt Leck. We got a really big conversation to share with y'all, so we're going to dive right in. Soon we're going to be joined by José Luis Granados Ceja and Kurt Hackbarth, two excellent journalists from Mexico and hosts of the Soberanía podcast. Kurt Hackbarth is also a frequent contributor to Jacobin magazine, whose work is indispensable. And we're going to get into this, but I just wanted to note up top what has happened in Mexico over the past few years, first under AMLO and now continued under the work of Claudia Sheinbaum, has been nothing short of transformative. This has been a country that had a serious democracy deficit that has now expanded and brought in so many everyday people into the political process. We're going to be trying to do a lot more coverage on Mexico here at the Jacobin Show. We're hoping to regularly have our good friends from Soberanía on the podcast as well. So please let us know questions, concerns, concepts, and topics you'd like to hear us talk about in the near future. I will just say on my own that what has happened in Mexico, particularly one with this transformation, but particularly with this transfer of power between AMLO and Claudia Sheinbaum, has been something truly historic. So many left projects really have a difficult time finding the continuity between leadership. You can see this all throughout the pink tide, and even arguably in the United States, the presidency of FDR, a lot of that work seriously begins to slow down after he is no longer the president. And it doesn't seem like that work is slowing down. Morena is an interesting political vehicle. There's a lot of kind of important philosophical and theoretical questions to be answered, and specifically seeing how long it is able to last. But what we have seen has been this massive expansion of democracy and participation from working people who are often written off in Mexican politics. So there's a lot of lessons that we can take and learn from Mexico. It's a very important country for many reasons, particularly for us in the United States. I hope y'all had a wonderful Thanksgiving weekend, and I'm really glad that y'all are tuning into the show. Don't forget to subscribe to Jacobin, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and share as widely as possible to let folks know that the Jacobin Show is back. We had a really great conversation last week with Brendan James and Robin Woensley we had Brendan James to talk about South Africa, the new Blowback podcast, and Dick Cheney, and Robin, who's an excellent DSA member in Minneapolis, joined us to talk a lot of social strategy. So if you missed that episode, go back and rewatch it, check it out, and share. But without further ado, let's get to our conversation with José Luis and Kurt Hackbarth. Welcome back, everybody, to the Jacobin Show. I'm really thrilled to be introducing y'all to our guests. If you've been Left Reckoning listeners for years, you'll be very familiar with them. But if this is your first time hearing it, these are our two very good friends, José Luis Granados Ceja and Kurt Hackbarth. They run the excellent Soberanía podcast, and Kurt regularly writes for Jacobin magazine. And I believe by the time this is out, we'll have a new piece on the topic that we're going to be talking about, which is these protests in Mexico, across the country, but specifically Mexico City. Thank you all so much for joining us on the Jacobin Show.
Thanks so much, guys. Real pleasure to do the crossover here from Left Reckoning onto the Jacobin Show.
100%. And as y'all can see, they have a wonderful studio, which I've appeared in person in Mexico City. Soberanía is actually a really, really critical resource for just, coverage of Mexican politics. It's a really great things to have English language coverage of, the region in general. So really can't recommend people listen to that enough. But let's get to the nitty gritty here. Claudia Sheinbaum continues to be a really transformative president in Mexico, a very popular one, and yet there were massive protests against her and the government here very recently, and we've been getting some different spin depending on where you get your news here. But let me just play a little clip of what happened just the other day. So, depending on where you get your news from, you might be believing that Mexico is now faced a coup or a revolution of some sorts. What are we seeing here, and what is actually going down on the ground?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to give the context that the Anglophone media tends to leave out for rather obvious reasons. What I mentioned, and I go into this in quite a bit of detail in the piece in Jacobin this week, is this is a really good example of what I call the franchise model of international demonstration symbolism. Right? Back 20 years ago, in the time of the color revolutions, a lot of them in the former Soviet republics, we saw the raised fists became like a kind of a franchise symbol that would bounce from country to country. It wound up in Venezuela, of all things, right? What we're now seeing is a similar use by Mexico's right wing of kind of the franchise model of the Jolly Roger flag from One Piece, which we've seen in countries like Indonesia and Nepal and Madagascar, right? In a very artificial attempt, a very astroturf attempt to graft that on to the Mexican political situation, right? So what we see here is a march this past Saturday, right? Supposedly it was called 15N, right? Which was billed as a youth march, right? It was billed as a youth march that was, arose out of the assassination of a mayor in the town of Uruapan, Michoacan, right? That in itself is a very real event, right? And, the Michoacan is a state in Mexico that has, experienced a lot of organized crime and has seen a number of mayors killed over the years. So nothing of this is to minimize what happened in Michoacan. The situation, however, is that right-wing interest, and it's funny that Mexico's right wing is very good in dressing itself up as something else, because Mexico's right-wing parties are so deeply unpopular here. I'm talking about the PRI that governed Mexico, most of the 20th century, and the very right-wing Catholic PAN party. They're so low in the polls that they've become very adept at dressing up their rallies as something else. Throughout the period of López Obrador, we saw a number of what was called the Pink Tide marches, totally right-wing marches, but they were dressed up as being nonpartisan civil society marches. And this is what we saw last Saturday. It was very similar demographically to the Maria Rosa marches, middle and upper middle class, middle-aged and senior citizens, very right-wing. And what we noticed covering the march is how quickly the issue that was supposedly motivating the march, which was the assassination of this mayor, very quickly got lost among some real nastiness in the march. Slurs against President Sheinbaum and anatomically, her ethnicity, her religion, this kind of anti-Morena stuff, real kind of, narco state, and whether Mexico is a narco state or a country that's been overwhelmed by organized crime, they couldn't seem to kind of agree amongst themselves. And then when the march got to the Zocalo, some real deliberate provocation, which Jose Luis can talk more about because he was in the Zocalo and I was in the back, right? Most of the time, these marches end up with a speaker. And maybe a speaker might have done something to organize this kind of real hodgepodge of hate into something resembling, legitimate grievances and a legitimate message, but there was no speaker. And as we got to the Zocalo, it became very clear why that was. This wasn't an organic march designed to present demands, but it was very much an astroturf march designed to create artificially induced scenes of conflict and clashes for international consumption. And that's exactly what happened, right? Some of the scenes that you were showing at the beginning of the program then led to all the right-wing accounts, Alex Jones and all this saying, Mexico's revolution is nigh, and trying to basically play this up as a legitimate youth protest when there were very few youth there.
Well, I want to get
exaggerating it. The average age was about 55 to 60, and that's probably being generous.
Well, I want to get into some of the ways that it was misrepresented, but just before we get into that, let's just talk a little bit about the scale, if y'all could, because again, like the way that this was being kind of covered, kind of breathlessly. Certainly, as Kurt, you noticed in your piece, it's not just far right accounts; it was also a lot of mainstream media as well.
Into the framing, sure.
But before we get into how it's kind of misrepresented, who represents all this kind of stuff, the biggest thing is that, again, if you are consuming the news via Twitter, there was this kind of sense that, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are like, walking off their jobs and, working to, take back their government from this kind of narco system that they live under. Could you just talk about like the scale here and maybe use some comparisons from other reporting that y'all have done in the past?
Yeah, sure. So Kurt was talking about how this was in some ways a manifestation of this right-wing movement that we'd seen before called the Marea Rosa, right? The pink tide, not to be confused with the pink tide governments of Latin America. That's just the name that they adopted because they started using pink in their demonstrations. And if you want to use that as a reference point, in fact, you can actually say that the mobilization was less than what we had seen in previous years. Certainly, there were people out on the streets. Mass politics, mass demonstrations is a feature of Mexican politics. It's not unusual to see the opposition demonstrate on the streets, although when it really becomes a test is who can mobilize more, over the years we've seen clearly the pro-government forces, Morena, is much, much better at mobilizing people. They've had up to 500,000 people turn out for a demonstration. Claudia Sheinbaum had a demonstration with 350,000 people. This one was smaller. This opposition demonstration a few weeks ago now was smaller in comparison. And you can always kind of use the Zócalo as your tool of measurement because it takes about 150,000 people who are really packed in there to fill it out. And it wasn't even half full. Even in the kind of the height of the amount of people who had come in, it wasn't quite to that degree. And because, as Kurt was alluding to, all of this was actually about setting the scene to make it seem like precisely this is, hundreds of thousands out on the people and they all, are contemplating the same thing to produce precisely the scenes that we saw. But the point I wanted to emphasize, as Kurt said, that we kind of split up. They handled the middle class side of things, like the middle-aged people posing as Gen Z on Paseo de la Reforma, that big street that cuts through Mexico City in the heart of the capital. And then what happened in the Zócalo. So I was in the Zócalo. And as soon as I got there, it was evident. I've covered a lot of demonstrations that have had these kinds of clashes between anarchist-minded, kind of influenced protesters, the so-called Black Bloc, and the police. This is, again, not too unusual in Mexico, but this was not that. This was not the Black Bloc. This was not anarchist groups kind of, challenging the monopoly of violence of the state. These were paid shock groups. And it was super evident because quite literally, as soon as I walked onto the square, I ran into somebody who was coordinating the action. And I have video of that. You can go on my social media if you want to see it. I'll share it with you later if you want. But you can see somebody clearly directing the action. And now that we're a couple of weeks removed from these events, more evidence has come out. And it turns out that a lot of the people who were doing precisely that, the agitating and the mobilizing, the directing, were people who are tied to the political opposition here, where they're political operators who are connected to, for example, and now this is all allegedly, nothing's been proven in court yet, connected to the local borough mayor of Cuauhtemoc here in Mexico City. People who are quite literally on the payroll of the opposition political parties or the opposition where they, hold some degree of political power, like the borough that I just mentioned. And so, there's now evidence been coming out where they forced some of the people in the informal economy who kind of operate on the fringes of legality, selling their wares on the streets of Mexico City, to go to this demonstration and to participate in this and agitate to do precisely what we saw, so that we could feed this narrative that we saw of clashes and a repressive government. And that's been the line that they've now been adopting, right? Morena is just the same as the pre-dictatorship, and they crack down on students and they're repressing all the rest of it, when this was clearly, from my judgment as a journalist, 20 years experience, many years now living in Mexico, covering these demonstrations, these were paid shock groups who were trying to produce precisely these scenes for foreign consumption.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, you definitely get the sense of that, but let's kind of get into this, the kind of political nature of the protest. And you'll have this really great video that I think does kind of reveal, one, the kinds of folks who are showing up, and two, their mindset. Because one thing I really want to make clear to our audience who hasn't been following Mexican politics, Sheinbaum is just immensely popular. I mean, it's really shocking how popular she is. And there's a lot of work with this protest to try to make it seem like, yeah, she's like a tyrant who's just barely holding on to power. Y'all had somebody on the street for Soberanía there and put together many great videos, including this one. And this just gets into some of the kind of conspiratorial aspects of these folks. Let me play this right quick for y'all.
Can I ask what you think about the nearly 80% approval rate of Sheinbaum?
No. They bought that. They don't. That is not true.
According to El Financiero, it's about 76%.
Yeah, but that is not true. No.
When Bueno, si tiene el 80% de la aprobación de este país, que lo saque a las calles, que lo saque, que no blinde sus edificios. Si la gente ama a este gobierno, ¿por qué blinda los edificios? ¿A qué le tiene miedo? Que saque a la calle a los que la aprueban y salimos a enfrentarlos.
Now, I would just note that they have had an election there pretty recently that has a pretty, effective ways of measuring public support. But I mean, talk a little bit about this kind of conspiratorial attitude here that, again, is trying to present something so different from, I think, the reality that's been fairly well documented at this point of the popularity of this government.
I'll let you jump in, but I wanted to actually respond to that one because it's quite interesting. She asked, the second one says, oh, well, why do they protect the buildings? In fact, there was a whole campaign on social media telling people how to break down the fences that they put up, at training people. People showed up with, these portable battery-operated saws to kind of cut down the fencing so that they could pull it down. People showed up with ropes and with chains. I mean, this was all very much premeditated. If you ask why did they put the fences up, because they knew what was coming. And I think also when she says, well, why does she take people out to the streets? As I mentioned, in other demonstrations where the president has called for mobilization, the response has been overwhelming, far larger than what the opposition has been able to pull out. And also, in December, on the 6th of December, there's going to be a pro-government demonstration, and I think it'll be interesting to see how many people show up to that one, just to, if you want to measure who's able to mobilize.
There'll be her answer there.
Yeah, indeed. Go back to the point about Sheinbaum and her popularity, because I think it's very, very important. In every major poll, right, except for one regional poll that was, that the Deutsche Welle dug up out of somewhere, Claudia Sheinbaum's popularity is between 70 and 80%. After a pretty active first year of governance, having to deal with Donald Trump and having to deal with a series of challenges, right? She's at 70 to 80%, actually higher than when she was inaugurated. Yeah. And also she has a majority of approval on the security issue. So it's not like security is a separate issue in the popularity. It's also a majority there. Right?
And from young people.
And from young people, right? So that's important, right? In the context where Trump is in his 30s, Keir Starmer is at 13%, I think. Macron is at 16%. Like, adding the popularity of those three leaders together, Sheinbaum is still ahead. So just to put that a little bit in perspective there, right? So why do we see what we see in some of, the on-the-street interviews we did? Precisely because Mexico has a right-wing rump, right? Right to far right-wing rump that historically has always been pro-United States to the point of openly asking for U.S. intervention. That's been part of actually the tragedy across Latin America, right? These sellout, people call them traitorous right wings that identify more with the United States than with their own country. So we see a right-wing senator here, Lili Tellez, openly calling for U.S. intervention. One of the people we interviewed was saying Trump would be 1,000 times better than Sheinbaum, and was actually complaining about immigration entering the United States. Oh, yeah. It's like, my God. Mm-hmm. Now, that's always existed. That's always been a factor in Mexican politics, this sellout right wing. And it's a part of the reason why they're so deeply unpopular and why they have to dress themselves up as being nonpartisan, civil society members rather than openly right wingers, because that is so repudiated in Mexico, right? So that's always been there. What has been a recent phenomenon has been the use of right and far right wing media to whip up these people into a real froth. Kind of a dynamic we've seen, of course, in the United States, and we've seen across South America and Brazil and Argentina. So you see media like TV Azteca, which is the second largest television station in Mexico. The owner is Ricardo Salinas Pliego. Now, I mentioned this in the last part of the piece because it's very important, and we've talked in Left Reckoning about the judicial reform, which happened very recently in Mexico, and it's fundamental to understanding what's happening, right? Because the oligarchy in Mexico have always had the judiciary in their back pocket. It's always been their get-out-of-jail-free card, right? It's always been their thing. So, right, there was a constitutional amendment this year due to, López Obrador's political savvy and the movement behind him. Mexico amended its constitution to provide for the direct election of the entire federal judiciary. So this year, half of the federal judiciary was elected and an entire new Supreme Court directly elected. Well, this newly separated Supreme Court has somewhat less patience with this oligarch, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, dragging a back tax bill of almost $4 billion in cases dating back to 2008, which he's been trying to delay and suspend and injunction and all this. Finally, he was ruled against in mid-November, and that was when he really went into attack mode. And that was the network that was, pushing this march, advertising this march, giving top billing to the march everywhere, and trying to make it up as bigger than it was. Right? So it's important to understand it's very clearly a class issue. It's just nakedly so. You have one of Mexico's biggest oligarchs and owner of a television station, Berlusconi style, or he'd like to be because he wants to run for president, openly whipping up people with far-right rhetoric. We also see media like La Derecha Diario, run by Argentine far-right interests like Javier Negre, who is now a fixture at Oval Office press conferences. Glorifying these attacks on police, right? There was one video of a policeman getting whipped around and beaten with those same tools and a gash on his head. And they were basically excusing it because it's supposedly it's a narco government. So if you want to understand why people are whipped up, you have to see that that's the international element to it. And just to conclude, because it's important, our podcast began out of anger over the attempt by U.S. press to try to find a link between López Obrador and organized crime, right? At the outset of the 2024 presidential campaign, right? Outlets like ProPublica, sad to say, right? But also Incite Crime and Deutsche Welle, right? It had no effect on the presidential campaign, but there it was, right? Now you have, according to the newspaper Milenio, which is hardly a friend to the Mexican left, 8 million bots were paid to whip up support for this march, 15N, right? Occupying some 46% of the entire conversation on social media. So it was the largest such campaign in Mexico since then, since that 2024 presidential campaign. Artificial inflation through bots coming from countries like Spain and Argentina and the like. So one has to understand the international element to this. It's not just a question of taking the Jolly Roger franchise and attempting to apply it, AstroTurf style. It's the internationalization of far-right destabilization attempts.
Yeah. And on that note, the interesting thing is that I've made the case that I think what we saw play out, while there's certainly an international element that kind of latched on, I think very much responds to what Kurt was saying about kind of the class conflict as it's playing out right now in Mexico with these very hard, sharp differences with certain oligarchs. We've already talked about in previous occasions, Claudia X Gonzalez, who's basically the man who sponsored the opposition during the last election cycle, forcing them to run together as part of his strategy to win the presidency. Obviously, it didn't work, but also characters like Ricardo Salinas Pliego. But I will say this, there was a recent poll that came out, and that strategy to kind of sow this idea that Claudia Sheinbaum's government is unstable and that is, teetering on the brink of collapse. It didn't work here in Mexico at all. The population was not convinced whatsoever. I think they very much clearly saw this for what it was, another opposition demonstration that really was trying to take advantage of legitimate grievances around security in certain parts of the country, which I think it's worth emphasizing that there are issues. There is discontent around this, although there's also, an important improvement around this. But I wonder if we can say the same about the international audience, because I think it really did have far-reaching consequences in terms of Mexico's image internationally, which I think is something that is a cause for concern because they're going to keep pressing on this. But on that note, I would say I don't know if they actually have the capacity to do Venezuela-style guarimbas, right? Where these are months-long protests drawn out, where youth were on the street for extended periods of time, because they tried to do a demo the following Thursday, and they had two meeting points. One at the university, where literally nobody showed up. 0 people showed up to the university demonstration, and a handful of, again, mostly middle-aged people showed up to the one at the Angel of Independence. So I think in terms of if they're thinking that this is their strategy to continue to calentar las calles, as we say here in Mexico, to kind of heat up the streets and cause these kinds of conflicts, it's not clear that they have the capacity to do it right now.
Well, I put a link in my article, which you can watch, which is the look of utter disappointment by the radio host Ciro Gomez Leiva from Radio Formula, which is quite a right-wing radio station here. When they went to their correspondent there at the Angel, is like, there's really nobody there? Really? There's nobody there?
And it's funny because the correspondent says, unfortunately, nobody is here. And then they had to cover for her and be like, surely she means unfortunately as a journalist, right?
Yeah.
It shows you, if she said that, that's because she was told the line is, this is a good demo. We should speak positively about it. Right. And when she got there and saw that nobody was there, her own conscience betrayed her, and she ended up letting it slip and saying, oh, unfortunately, nobody showed up, which obviously reveals their bias.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it was probably, I mean, it was certainly a disappointing event, at least how it was built, was one being Gen Z protests when, as you all have shown, and we've been talking about, I mean, the average age is much older than Gen Z. I mean, you probably couldn't even call it a millennial protest, frankly. And then on the other side, that, it's supposed to be about like the cartels and violence in Mexico. And yet a lot of the commentary they were getting from people is about how great Trump is and slurs and epithets against Sheinbaum. But I want to talk about like what's being attacked here, like what the right is trying to unseat, because what has been so notable about Mexico, first through AMLO and then through Claudia Sheinbaum, has been how successful this project has been. And maybe to get us started, we can talk about, one of the things that might still be fairly controversial in the sense that it's like not completed yet, which is like kind of violent crime in Mexico, right? This is responding to a very horrific event. But I wanted to ask y'all, in the same ways as in the US, where you'll see kind of protests against, different city governments or city officials that don't always kind of line up that well with crime statistics, right? Where cycle crime might be going down, but everyone getting, is going out and getting polled and saying that they're very worried about crime. Is something similar going on in Mexico? I mean, what has Sheinbaum's record been, particularly on violent crime in Mexico?
I'll start out by saying that I think the president's response on the Monday following these demonstrations was actually really instructive. She says, all right, so there are critics, but what are they offering? What is their proposal? Because it sounds like some of them want to go back to the failed strategy of Felipe Calderon from 2006, which was an all-out conflict, all of the strength of the state security forces against select organized crime groups, because, of course, there were some that were benefiting from the state intervention during those years, namely the people who were connected to Garcia Luna, who is now in jail as a result of his connections to organized crime. But I think it's important to think about that. Like, are they proposing that we go back to that, to the so-called war on cartels? Because that's a non-starter in Mexico. Nobody supports that idea except for the hardline opposition, which wants to kind of defend Calderon's legacy for whatever reason. This hardline strategy has been tried and it failed, and it's largely the reason we're in this place in the first place. And what we've seen from Sheinbaum on the security issue has been one that is far more emphasis on investigation, on cutting off the supply of money to these groups to kind of really cut their feet out from under them, as opposed to clashes in the streets. Because, as I said, we've been through this. And what did that produce? All it did was splinter organized crime groups and actually led to more kind of violent and vicious leaders rising up because they were the ones who were to fill that void. That's not the strategy the government's pursuing now. And I think actually what we're seeing is really important figures in terms of like the actual drops of major crime. But the thing is that there are security challenges in this country, and they will probably never really be solved until our neighbor to the north, the United States, starts treating its problem with the demand side of things as the public health concern that it is, as opposed to the crime issue that it is, or even as we're seeing now, these extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean. A lot of the solution is out of our hands, and so that's what puts us in a difficult position in terms of the iron river of guns, as it's called, that's flowing from the United States into Mexico, that arms these groups, that makes them as violent as they are. The amount of money, all of the laundering that happens in banks in the United States and Mexico that allows them to carry this kind of stuff out. Like, I think that's the thing we need to focus on when we talk about this. But I do think I want to give voice to the legitimate concerns that the population, certainly in places like Michoacan, where this mayor was from, but places like Sinaloa, which are dealing with really serious quality of life issues, right? Because these organized crime groups have now expanded beyond just, drug smuggling and all the rest of it, but like the extortion rackets, for example, the so-called protection fees that they charge small business owners. Those are the things that really kind of are generating a genuine discontent amongst the population, which can be addressed, but arguably, we couldn't even begin to address it until the passage and the implementation of the judicial reform because of the barrier.
On that point, just really quick, I mean, but it's not as if like Sheinbaum and before her AMLO were kind of sitting back on their hands on this issue, right?
No, of course not. I mean, AMLO created the National Guard. He saw that the federal police, which was deeply corrupted, many of its leadership is also facing charges or has been convicted of ties to organized crime groups, dissolves that, creates the National Guard that would be on a permanent deployment and actually kind of in communities and addressing the security situation. So there's also been work around that. I think it's important to mention, of course, in terms of like the security situation in this country.
Yeah, so the overall number, Claudia Sheinbaum as mayor of Mexico City reduced violent crime by half in the city. And the first year of her presidency, she's shown she's been able to, because the question was, would she be able to take the successes in Mexico City to the rest of the country, which is a very different country. Rural Mexico is very different from urban Mexico and very different from Mexico City in particular. So far she has, in a national sense, in the sense that she's reduced the murder rate by 37% in her first year in office, right? If you look back over previous presidents, and Felipe Calderon in 2006, who took office after a fraudulent election, in a bid to kind of legitimate himself and with an inferiority complex over him, launched a war on drugs precisely in that state, Michoacan, his home state, which López Obrador warned at the time that was just going to be whacking the hornet's nest stupidly, without a plan. And it turned out to be right. It spread organized crime out in places where it hadn't existed before, and it fragmented groups. So instead of dealing with a couple major groups, you're dealing with, more. At the same time as Calderon was carrying out this massive war on drugs strategy, basically, Reagan in the 80s and the Plan Colombia in the 90s, trying to import those ideas here, his own security minister was in cahoots with the Sinaloa cartel. Genaro Garcia Luna, who is now in jail in the United States. So, I mean, we're talking about complicity at that scale. So when López Obrador comes into the presidency in 2018, he was faced with complicity at basically all levels of the police, which is why he disbanded that previous national police contingent and went with the National Guard, as we mentioned. Now, that said, has the problem been eradicated? Of course it hasn't. And it won't be as long as the dynamic with the United States exists. Have there been advances? Yes, there have. So especially in states like Guanajuato, which concentrated a large number of the assassinations in the country, right? It gets complex because it's not just a straight organized crime bang bang issue, but like any mafia, they diversify into other industries, like extortion, like you said. Michoacan in particular is the state that produces, I think, 70% of the avocados of the country. And of course, that's become a huge export crop to the United States so that everybody can have their, guacamole dip for the Super Bowl. So organized crime then forces people to plant avocados and gets into that racket, or limes, or the water issue. In a country that's increasingly has water problems, Michoacan is water rich. It's mineral rich. So that means, it diversifies, and then you have to diversify your way of going about it. And it's, it's important to note that there have been, a number of mayors assassinated in Michoacan over recent years. And there have been, other towns like Cuitzeo, which is in the Bajío region, where the current mayor, I think, has faced 3 different attempts. Wow. So no one wants to minimize it, and one has to have a great degree of sensitivity to people who are in those parts of the country where organized crime is a part of their daily lives, and not minimize it and not just try to throw statistics at them, right? Has to have that very front and center. But at the same time, not let that become, right, a club with which international far-right interests can use to whack a very popular progressive government that is doing good things on a large number of fronts.
Well, and I would just add, we've covered this a bit on Left Reckoning with other folks, but I think it's an important thing to remember that, organized crime does not live in a vacuum outside of global capital. And like there's a kind of a violent aspect to this, as you're kind of noting, even just with agricultural products in Mexico. But in the last few minutes, and I think what we're going to have to do is have y'all on in the near future and have y'all on regularly to maybe go over, let's say, the history of, Morena and all of this. But in this last 10 minutes or so, I really wanted to spend some time talking about the successes of both Sheinbaum and AMLO here, because the right is really grasping at straws, and they've been grasping at straws for a long time. Now, the perspective you might get in the United States is very different from what's actually happening on the ground in Mexico. But this has been a project that has been I mean, world historic, particularly in what it has done for engaging everyday folks, the kind of folks who don't tend to have political influence, or at least don't have governments trying to meet their needs, in bringing them into politics. And I think that's something that the right very much resents, because they don't really have a strategy out of this. Other than kind of doing this kind of spectacle. So could y'all talk a little bit, particularly about Sheinbaum, but obviously AMLO as well, about this kind of inclusion of working people in politics in Mexico that has been such a hallmark of this great transformation?
Sure, I'll start. We could do, as you said, a whole other program or a series of programs on this. But I think the symbol of what's been happening, right, is that great image on one of those conservative marches, right, of a worker who stuck his arm out the window of a bus and showed his muscle and said, "These are the people that move Mexico, the workers."
That's incredible.
And I think that's been so important, has been the return of class politics to Mexico, and really openly class politics in Mexico. They had always tried to, the right wing, cover up the right wing interest by saying that they're civil society, right? And it used bizarre use of civil society, which Gramsci used in a very different context, right? But that is what I think is the focal point here, the return of class politics. So what you see, and it's been, born electoral fruits, is where so many other countries have gone through either what we call a pacification for what happened in Greece, or de-alignment is also another popular term. What we've seen here is in Mexico has actually been a class realignment, in the sense of working class vote was split in the 2018 presidential campaign. More of it came home, in quotes, in the 2021 midterms and flooded to Morena in the 2024 presidential election, which Claudia Sheinbaum won by 30 points. And that has a lot to do with, very specifically, worker-friendly legislation. And I'm talking about, first of all, social programs, a universal pension, stay-in-school scholarships for youth, disability pension, aid to single mothers, right? All of the outlines of a, still rudimentary, but getting there, of a welfare state that Mexico never had, right? It was always client-based, based on supporting a party and you would get something for that. These programs are now universal. So the social programs, for one, right? I mean, the universal pension has been a life changer for people. Just like people forget in the United States that the highest poverty rate before Social Security was amongst senior citizens. Mexico was living that up until very, very recently. In many cases still is, right? Outsourcing reform, which restricts companies from getting around labor law by outsourcing every one of their functions. So now they cannot no longer outsource core functions. Union reform, trade union reform, to provide for secret ballot elections for unions and renegotiation of contracts and the like. Raises of the minimum wage over 100% over AMLO's terms, and those are continuing now under Sheinbaum, right? Sheinbaum is also lowering the pension age for women down to 60, right? These are just a few of the things. Jose Luis can talk about more. What Sheinbaum's emphasis on this is to build on that. She was openly a continuity candidate, but add to that, infrastructure projects as well, bringing trains back to Mexico. They're doing now 2 long-distance train lines up to you guys there in Texas, and then one over a bit farther over, right? Bringing the train network back, right? Which had been privatized in the 90s. Also an emphasis on science and technology. Sheinbaum wants to bring out an electric car, the Olinia, put a satellite into space, bring Mexico into the semiconductor age, really put an emphasis on science and technology. López Obrador's real focus was on basic sovereignty because he had to bring the country back from the brink in energy and in food. Energy and food, energy and food. And now Sheinbaum wants to extend that to an industrial planning model, which includes science and technology and kind of using the greater public control over energy to get, lead to a more vertical green transition, right? Public sector led. And that's what's called the Plan Mexico, which is this plan now to use an industrial planning policy to develop Mexico on its own terms, not just as a place for multinationals to come in and call themselves Mexican industries, but really expatriate profits, right? So that's a part of it. And surprise, surprise, right? When you when you pass legislation that helps people actually vote for you instead of just lecturing them or looking down at them or calling them deplorable, right?
Yeah.
Well, Jose Luis, I mean, I want to throw you on this. I would just I really want to highlight this because I think in the U.S., I mean, Claudia is very charismatic. There's a lot of people who are very excited by her, particularly like, her strength in dealing with figures like Trump. But I think there has been almost an overemphasis on, let's call it like the symbolic or the kind of performative aspect of the politics. When, everything that Kurt just noticed, I mean, we're talking real material experiences. I mean, it's great to, to use certain kinds of rhetoric and to talk in the way that both she and AMLO did in the past about everyday folks. But I mean, they're really doing stuff for everyday people, right?
That's just it, right? The slogan that I think really resonates with a lot of people. I've done a couple workshops over there with people in the United States, and they love it when they say, for the good of everybody, the poor come first, right? Of naming the poor, of saying specifically, we are designing policies for the poor people of this country to lift them out. And as Kurt was talking about, the numbers speak for themselves in terms of the 13 million people.
13.5 million people lifted out of poverty.
In a single 6-year term, lifted out of poverty. I mean, those kinds of numbers, I think, can only be rivaled by the kinds of gains that China has made, right?
In the midst of a pandemic.
Exactly. In addition to that. So, but I think one thing that's also important about that is that these sort of class-conscious policies can deliver more than just material gains, but political victories. One thing that I always think is important to emphasize when we talk about Mexico is that, as Kurt said, Claudia built on the coalition, expanded it, brought the working class into the fold under Morena's leadership, and all of that is really important. But the fact that in the last election, there was an explicit call to give a supermajority to Morena so that it could continue to push forward, and that they have, and that they've taken that mandate that they asked for and received. And I've always made the argument that it was a conscious decision by the Mexican population to say, we should deliver a supermajority to these. We're going to vote massively for Morena and its political allies so that they're able to do this. And they have, and they followed through on it, right? Like this idea of actually being very ambitious in your politics. And there are echoes of that in other politicians that we're seeing emerge now. Obviously here I'm talking about somebody like Zoran Mamdani in New York City, who really kind of is laser focused on his messaging. Yes, that's all good and well, and obviously that's something to be emulated. But like the idea that you're focusing on actually delivering the things that will improve people's lives materially, and understanding the link to politics, of the idea that it has to be accompanied by people out on the street and people taking out the initiative and knocking on doors and convincing their neighbors, right? The fact I mentioned previously that nobody really fell for this right-wing narrative about a government on the brink of collapse here in Mexico. That's a product of what we call here in Mexico, the revolution of the consciousness, of people being like, you can't fool us anymore. And that part is really important because it opens all kinds of new paths in terms of what you can do. You have more confidence now to take on your class enemies in a way that it'll actually reconfigure the balance of forces in a way that will deliver dividends, not just for the next election cycle, but we're talking about decades down the road. It's going to be really hard to see another right-wing government in this country, if all things stay the way that they are, because of that heightened level of consciousness. And that's always been a central thing about this. It's just, yes, your life is improving materially, but it's improving materially because of political decisions that are happening that weren't being taken before, right? Before there was this adherence, this loyalty to neoliberalism that has been explicitly rejected in favor of a more redistributed policy, and understanding that that's made possible by people exercising their vote, yes, but also being active in their communities and convincing their friends and neighbors.
No, I mean, it is amazing. And I said this before bringing y'all on, that what Morena has been able to do, it's an interesting party structure, and we'll have you on again to kind of talk about it. But, there was a lot of questions about this transition from Sheinbaum to AMLO, how that was going to work out. And the fact of the matter is just what's already happening there is pretty unique. I mean, oftentimes when these kind of left-wing leaders are no longer the leader of the country, it's hard to continue the momentum. I mean, there are plenty of examples for the pink tide. Hell, even in the United States, it's pretty arguable that post-FDR, that kind of movement stops here as well. So it is something that's super unique. And the best place, other than tuning into Jacobin, to keep, or reading Kurt and Jacobin, is to listen to and subscribe to the Soberanía podcast. How can folks do that, friends?
It's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We upload every Wednesday, 9:30 in the morning, to give you a breakdown of that week's news and events. And then we always give a little bit of a media criticism at the end, because part of the reason people don't know Mexico is because of the poor media coverage. And really, and one thing I wanted to say is, like, we're so close. And in your case, you're like, we were literally neighbors and here. And I think people can take inspiration. They don't have to look too far. It's not a place that is in, kind of in the imaginary of a faraway place. It's something that's very close to home, and in a lot of ways is similar, right? Some of the population, the form of government, like there's a lot of
They
lessons.
such, Mexico and the United States are condemned to live next to each other, right? They're
For good and the bad.
two brothers by a different mother, whatever the metaphor you want to use. There are 37 million people of Mexican descent in the United States. And I think sometimes there's this idea of, oh, I know Mexico, because it's right there. Mexico is a really complex country that really is worth knowing better, right? And it's certainly worth knowing much better than the awful coverage in most of the English language press, which is how this whole project started. We're also over at Channel 11, Mexico's Canal 11, on a show called Sin Muros, Without Walls, and we go do deep dives into the U.S.-Mexico relationship. All of those episodes are online, and they're at least ones from this year are subtitled in English.
Yeah.
So there's some good material there as well.
So those are available on YouTube. We actually made sure that the content that we were producing there for that channel is also available to all the viewers and listeners in the United States. And before I go, I want to say congratulations on the show. It's great. I can't think of a better person to run this show. It's going to be really exciting to be in touch over the coming years, hopefully.
Hopefully a long time.
And hopefully a long time, so we can keep talking about Mexico, Latin America, everything to do with this bilateral relationship.
Well, thank y'all so much for joining us. And to the audience, y'all heard it here. Would y'all like to see them come on more regularly? What would you like us to talk about? Leave comments below. Subscribe to Jacobin. Thank you so much for tuning in today, everybody. And we'll see you very, very soon.
Thank you.